turning out. This is such a great turnout. I do this a lot. As you heard, I am the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition. We're a program of Smart Growth America, which is an organization that works to improve lives by improving communities throughout the United States. Another way to think about that is that when I was in school and I was doing community development, we looked at two different ways. There's the way that you do people-placed development and place-based, and we really work in that place-based space. So affordable housing, responsible real estate development, and transportation is a huge part of that, and so that is the role that I serve. I am just really excited to be here today. I know many of you know each other in the room, and you've heard a little bit about us, and you'll probably hear more throughout the day, but I'd love to hear just by show of hands, like who's in the room, like who actually works for the city of Tucson? Oh, that's great. Who's running the city today? So within that, who's an engineer in the room? That is great. Your people. Your people. Who's a planner? Those are like my people, too. The policy people. Who's a policy person? Fire. That's great. We have police. Elected officials. They just left. We're going to give them a big round of applause. An advocate, community member. That's great. Who am I leaving out? Students. Landscape architects. Landscape. Public health.
Private sector.
Private sector. Perfect.
Nonprofit.
Anyone else?
Maintenance people.
Maintenance, yes.
Water department.
Water department.
Nonprofits.
Nonprofit. Are you nonprofit? Anyone
Yeah,
else?
I don't have any.
Work for nonprofit. So we're here today to talk about kind of what the foundations of complete streets are, what they aren't, and how you can bring them and realize that within your city, and this is a fantastic city, both through policy adoption and implementation. I have to start off by thanking the Living Streets Alliance, who has been so great to work with. I actually met Everin, who I'm sure many of you know, my very first week on the job. And so this has been a few years in the making. We met at the Walking Summit in Washington, D.C., and she was a member of the Walking College, and it just started, I don't even know how we met. It was a
networking reception that actually worked.
It was so networking, and so I can't believe that, I think it's about 2 years later we're here doing this. And I also want to thank Tim again, and this really shows, I'll start to talk about the National Complete Streets Steering Committee, but the role of public health and the Heart Association in supporting complete streets. I just wanted to give a broad overview of the coalition. You all are really lucky, and they don't even get to hear this, to have such great leadership in the city. They really gave the overview of kind of beginnings of complete streets, but really it started as a conversation about, and it started as a conversation actually back in Washington, D.C., but among engineers, planners, but also there were groups like AARP in the room, the National Association of Realtors, people who are still involved in the movement, who are thinking about how can we really start to think about all users of the transportation system when we make planning decisions. And what does that look like? And that's where that idea of complete streets was born. That it's really this idea, and your vice mayor said this, that it's about creating streets where, regardless of who you are or how you need to or want to travel, can travel safely, conveniently, affordably, reliably, and a reasonable amount of travel time to where you need to go. And whether that's to work, whether that's to your faith-based institution, whether that's to healthcare or your social networks, that you have those choices. Today, I'll talk about the elements of a complete streets policy. We have 1,300 complete streets policies in the United States. So we have really started, and this was actually originally aimed at the federal government. Shockingly, they did not pass complete streets legislation until 2 years ago. It's part of the last federal transportation bill called the FAST Act. But like so much of policy in the country and so many movements, local community said, we're not gonna wait a decade for the feds to get it. And in 2005, I think there were 34 complete streets policies. You can see how much, I don't need a bar chart to show how they've grown. Although I'm a part of Smart Growth America, really the leadership for this comes from, I forgot the clicker.
I got it.
You got it. Oh, that one. From a steering committee, and I like to show this slide not only because they support the movement, but it shows them the diversity of interest and who is represented within Complete Streets. Again, it's not just, I'm seen sometimes as like the bicycle and pedestrian person, which is great, and I love walking and I bike everywhere, but there's really a lot of groups involved. And you see landscape architect. I think we saw so many people represented. These are just the leadership. We have firms, we have advocacy groups. ARP actually serves as our vice chair, where the American Public Transit Association serves as the chair, the organizational chair. Tim is on our steering committee as a representative of the Voices for Healthy Kids campaign out of the American Heart Association. But the other things you don't see we actually have a lot of partners as well. So Public Works, I know we have some Public Works people here. As well as other nonprofits. This is really, and Veronica will cover the benefits, but why you see so many different interest groups involved in this movement, and they get involved for the economic benefits, the livability, kind of where, examples, the realtors do a study every year. That's their bread and butter to tell their members where people want to buy homes, and it's more and more walkable communities. ARP is involved because people want to age in place, but we need communities and built environments that support that. We have landscape architects involved because they really see the value of not just creating streets that work, but I'd say communities that work. We have a lot of firms that do this. We have some DOTs also involved. So that's really, that's the overview of the movement. The way that the day is going to work is Veronica is going to give an overview of kind of what are complete streets, what does that really mean? I think we have some ideas, and into the benefits. I'm going to talk about, really for the first time, this is exciting, our new framework for policy, for complete streets policies. We have been working on this for the past couple years and just adopted the new policy framework, and I'll talk about why we did that in the morning, and then in the afternoon we'll start to dig into what would that look like at the corridor level here, and then what are the policy choices you all would need to make that happen, and then we'll wrap up by really how do you create the plan and how do you start to think about moving this forward. So with that, I guess I get the pleasure of turning it over to Veronica, who I am so excited to introduce today, so thank you.
Thank you. Great. So everyone, I'm Veronica Davis, and I think it's important before we get into the agenda that you know who you're talking to. So I know you read my bio or you have access to it, but just a little bit more about me. I am the co-owner of Inspire Green, and I am a planner and I am an engineer. So I have a lot of interesting conversations with myself. A lot of conflicts that happen. And so within the District of Columbia, the DC metropolitan region, I've worked across pretty much all modes that are in the street. So we have a bus study going on now where we're trying to implement bus-only lanes. I have a protected bike lane project, which if you want to Google bike lanes in DC, we ended up in a First Amendment battle with the church over bike lanes. Who knew? And I had a meeting shut down by the library police, which I didn't even know the library had its own police force. Yeah, very interesting things. So that's a lot of what I deal with. And as you'll hear, I'll talk about the context that I come from, but then I will also relate it to some of the things that I've seen in my short time here in Tucson. So also you should know I am a community advocate. So I am an engineer, but I am a community advocate, and it's important because I do have an agenda. And personally, my agenda is I believe that transportation should be safe, reliable, affordable, and people should have options. So that is my personal agenda, and I know that a lot of times when we get news, people don't express where they're coming from, but I want you all to know where I'm coming from. And so even in my community, I've definitely fought for better roads, better infrastructure, particularly since the community that I used to live in was predominantly African American. And so whenever it was time to get infrastructure, that community was always the last. So making sure we're getting quality sidewalks and bike infrastructure. And as we talked about, I think your mayor talked about the bike share, I was a big proponent in fighting for bike share in neighborhoods east of the river, which are predominantly African American and then low income. I'm also the co-founder of Black Women Bike, so I am a person that bikes, but I bike for transportation. If you get me over 10 miles, I am disinterested. I'm not touring, I'm not doing a century, I'm not doing a race. I'm not wearing spandex. I actually have on my bike, friends don't let friends wear spandex. But what we are for Black Women Bike, it really is about getting women biking for whatever reason they want to bike. So whether they just want to bike to the end of the block, or if they want to bike across the country, we did have a group that biked from Washington to Washington, D.C. That's, God bless them, it's not me. But really just making sure, and interestingly enough about Black Women Bike, is that we trend older. We are capturing retirees, women who are in their mid to late 60s, who are young and vibrant, who want to maintain an active lifestyle as they go into retirement because they want to be around for a while. So that is the bulk of who we are attracting on our rides and in a lot of our programming and our seminars. So I do bike, even though I have my little ped pin on today. And so the context, a lot of my projects, so I largely work in the District of Columbia. We also are working in Philadelphia and the region. So I am in kind of the ideal scenario, right? It's everything right, mixed use. We are a generally compact city. We have a lot of people in a very little space. We have buildings of several stories in different neighborhoods, multiple blocks with different building types, and we have a street grid, although we do have the diagonal streets. So if you ever drive in DC and experience that, you can get lost. So stay away from any street with a state name. But if you're on a letter and a number, you're good. It's just a grid. So it's really the ideal context, for projects. And I know you all looking at me like, whoa, it's great. But we have congestion. We are the most congested city in the country. And part of it is we have very narrow streets. This is 7th Street, right in Chinatown. It's one of our busiest thoroughfares. And this is like 11 o'clock at night. And we still have traffic. So we have a major traffic issue. And a lot of times when I'm working on projects, a policy decision that was made was you will stay within the curb line. You will not expand any curbs. This is what you have. So if it's 60 feet, you have 60 feet, and you need to figure it out and make it work. We don't move curbs in DC. We don't move them in, we don't move them out. We'll move them in, but we don't go out. And that is a policy decision that was made by our leadership. I'm also dealing with war, right? So this is an actual cover of the Washington Examiner. And it says, motorists fuming as bicyclists pack roads. And you can't quite see it because of the thing, but you see it's like fire and like flame. But that's a photo from Libya. It has nothing to do with it. Nothing at all, right? And so we have this, there is a war on cars, and that is everything that we're dealing with. One of the things with the district is our population doubles during the workday because we have people coming in from the suburbs of Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania are coming into the city. We also have all of our lovely tourists, and please come visit. So we do have this population increase that happens, and so we have this bike versus car dynamic that's happening, and it's playing out on the cover of an actual newspaper. And then we have this transition from urban to suburban. So I know you all are like, well, she's going to talk about complete streets, but she's got the ideal scenario, right? It's grids. So this is Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. So I am looking inbound. So that is the District of Columbia side. It's a great street. We have sidewalks, there's trees. Someone mentioned tree planting earlier. We have homes. It's really great. But this is the other side of that intersection. This is the same intersection. So this is looking west towards Maryland. So this is the border that this photo is taken from Google Earth. But this is the borderline. So looking west, that is Maryland. And look at the difference. Let me go back. So that's DC, and that's Maryland. This is an intersection. So you can even see that we're dealing with this awkward transition that happens. So the speed limit on the DC side is 30 miles an hour. The speed limit on the Maryland side is 55 miles an hour. So if you can imagine, people are coming into the city at high speeds, and then you want them to slow down. So that's a challenge that we're constantly dealing with. And this is just one example, particularly at the borders. So going into complete streets. So we'll talk a little bit about what are complete streets. Your mayor and vice mayor stole my thunder. Don't tell them, but they stole my thunder a little bit. We'll talk about why, who benefits, the different overall benefits. And then a little bit about implementation, and we're specifically going to be talking about Vision Zero, which is the sister to Complete Streets. So what are complete streets? So as mentioned earlier, it's really about giving each mode what they need, whether it's convenience, safety, comfort, reasonable travel time. And that does not mean that you don't have some level of delay. Okay, so it doesn't mean that we don't have, let there be light. So that there is some reasonable travel time. Because streets are inadequate. So these are just some examples. This is Route 1 in Northern Virginia. So we're still talking about the DC region. What is wrong with this picture? You can't see it? Let there be dark. All right, well, so this is Route 1 in Northern Virginia. There's no sidewalks, there's nowhere to cross. And one of the things that we deal with in our suburban areas, better? We'll roll with it. So one of the things that tends to happen, is that best? Yes. Okay, there you go. So one of the things that tends to happen in the suburbs outside of DC is they are very car-centric. And as you can see here, this is very car-centric, but there's a desire that people want to move. And then streets are inadequate. This is from Flint, Michigan. That's a bus stop. What is wrong with this picture? Robin, what is wrong with this picture?
There's no connectivity to the bus stop.
There's no connectivity to the bus stop. Anything else? What else is wrong with the picture? David, so you guys messed up by sitting in the front because of your only name tag I can read.
No shelter.
There's no bus shelter. There's no bench. There's nothing. All right. Streets are inadequate. What's wrong with this picture? No ADA access at all. All right. What's wrong with this? This is from San Francisco.
It actually looks like a bicyclist is trying to make a through movement from a left turn lane.
Yeah.
So it looks like there's a violation there that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so even when streets are adequate, so this is DC, this is L Street. So as you can see, there's a parking lane, there's 2 travel lanes, there is a protected bike lane, right? So we can say this is a complete street. Would we all agree that this is a complete street? Who agrees? If this is a complete street, raise your hand. Hi. Is it complete? Hi. All right, so everyone that doesn't have your hand raised, why is it not a complete street?
There's no people walking.
There's no people walking. It's the time of day. There's plenty of people that walk on the street. So why is it not a complete street? This isn't a trick question, I promise.
Mass transit there?
This particular street does not have transit. There is metro rail, but not on this block. Yes.
I'm kind of looking at the cross slope of the sidewalk on the left. That looks like it doesn't look particularly flat. I can see my wife sort of rolling out into the bike lane in her wheelchair.
Okay. And even when it's kind of adequate, this is the problem. So this is the same street, that same area. What's wrong with this picture? Right. And so I'm saying this because we have a major issue with freight in our bike lanes. And so that's the thing about complete street. You can do everything right and still miss a user. So we have not planned in designing this for how do we deal with freight, particularly in our downtown area where we don't have areas where freight can go. We don't have alleyways where freight can easily get in and out. So we have a whole, as a matter of fact, if you look at the hashtag on Twitter, parking dirty, there are thousands of photos in DC of literally called parking dirty. Even the police, not to pick on the police, but we have police that park in the bike lanes, and it's a constant issue. Or how they travel. And even though I know we're going to talk a lot about vulnerable users, we have to make sure that we're thinking about all users, whether it's freight, whether it's transit, whether it's people driving. So really thinking holistically about the street. And so who does complete streets benefit? So one, children. So right now, we have 1/3 of the children in the US are overweight or obese. I believe in this county, it's like 26.6%. And what that's leading to is that our kids aren't walking to school. As a matter of fact, just as we were sitting in the back, someone tweeted out on social media that only 12% of US kids walk to school. Whereas in 1969, that number was about 50%. So our kids aren't even getting basic exercise of being able to walk to school, walk to playgrounds, and so it's really having a health impact. So our other vulnerable users are older adults. We're living longer. You know, my grandmother is 94 years old, she still walks, and her neighborhood doesn't have sidewalks, but she loves to walk. And so imagine a 94-year-old who then gets hit by a motor vehicle. You know, that becomes a challenge, but our older adults want to stay active. As I mentioned in the beginning, with Black Women Bike, we're seeing a major trend of retiring women who want to get into biking as a form of transportation because they have time, they don't want to spend a lot of money on a car, they still want to live in their homes, they want to age in place and be a part of their community. So in order to do that, they need a different level of infrastructure so that they can move around. And then for the traffic engineers in the room, we also have to think about how people cross the street. Not everyone can do, 2.5 feet per second. Not everyone can walk at that speed. There's some streets in DC I can barely get across, and I'm a very fast walker. So those are just things that we need to think about as our population continues to age. And then there's persons with disabilities. So it's not even just wheelchairs, it's also people who are visually impaired, to make sure that as we're thinking about even the sidewalk, there's a lot that the sidewalk has to do, where you want, street cafes, green infrastructure is important to go into the sidewalk, and then people have to move as well. So as we're thinking about the sidewalk, making sure that people can move safely even without being able to see what's happening. The other challenge that we deal with too in DC is we have a large hearing impaired population because of Gallaudet University, which is a really large university for people without hearing. And so then we also have to think about, well, can two people walk down the street and have a conversation when their conversation isn't verbal, that we're all accustomed to? And then there's underserved communities. There's reports after reports after reports, and we're happy to share them with you after this. We know that people in particularly low-income communities, they're dying. They're dying on the roadways in this country, and it's all preventable. A lot of it tends to be sometimes mid-block crossing. A big issue is for shift workers who are biking and walking at those off hours. I think one of the challenges of our profession is that we're always thinking about rush hour. We're always thinking about getting people to work, but we forget that there are people who are moving at other times of the day and other days of the week, and particularly with shift workers, they're moving at maybe 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, maybe at noon, maybe 10, 11 o'clock at night. So as we're thinking about complete streets, let's think holistically about who is really using them and what time of the day that we're using them, and really thinking about the lower income communities and the underserved communities to make sure that we're really addressing a challenge that's happening there. One of the things about doing safety audits, so it's like, oh, well, once 5 people die, then we can fix this intersection. And it's like, okay, we're down to 4, one more death, and boom, we can go, we can fix it. And I'll talk a little bit about Vision Zero, about how we're being proactive in the district now. But that's a challenge, particularly since underserved communities, sometimes they don't have time to go to public meetings. They don't have time to put in a request. People are trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, and it's not that they don't care about what's happening in their community, but of all their cares, that's like number 10. And so everyone wins with complete streets. And a little bit about some of the benefits. So there's a safety benefit. So obviously, when complete streets are safe, it makes it safer for everyone. People can walk, people can move. When cars aren't going as fast, even for 2 people in a motor vehicle, it makes that safer if there is a crash. A crash at 30 miles an hour versus a crash at 50 miles an hour are going to have very different results. And then there's health benefits. And I'll skip ahead to this one. But we're moving without moving. We're sitting in our cars, sitting in traffic in places where that exists. And so as a result, what we're seeing is that we're having obesity. We're having all these different health issues that are quite frankly preventable just by getting moving a lot more. I mean, even on the weekends, people say, well, I can't bike to work. That's fine. You don't have to bike to work. But what about the grocery store that's a mile away? What about, to the park with your kids? Do you have to drive your kids to a park? so that they can go play? Or do you drive drive to the gym so you can use a treadmill? So those are things that we do where if we looked at our communities a little bit differently, we can, solve some of these health challenges. And so this is some resources that we have available in terms of the Center for Disease Control that residents want to walk. It's not even that it's about something that should happen, residents want it. And what we're seeing in terms of neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods are more expensive because that's where people desire to be. When there's things to walk to, when it's safe to walk, those are the desirable neighborhoods. And a lot of information that has come from SGA from like the realtors is that walkable neighborhoods with high walk scores are more valuable. And then the economic benefits. Earlier today we talked about Amazon. Amazon's looking for a new home. And so for economic benefits, in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is right outside of the District of Columbia, Marriott has their headquarters. But it used to be in a traditional suburban office park, car-centric, in the middle of nowhere. They are now moving their headquarters to Bethesda, Maryland, about a block away from a metro station. And that is going to be a huge economic boom for Bethesda, Maryland, and a major loss for Rockville, Maryland. And that's what we're seeing in the district is that everywhere, like the Silver Line just opened up in Northern Virginia. And even with the Silver Line opening up, there are cranes everywhere along the metro stations because businesses are realizing if they want to attract talent, they need to be in places where the talent wants to be. And the talent of the future, they want to be in walkable neighborhoods. I read a staggering statistic recently that millennials are not getting driver's license, and then the generation behind the millennials, they're not really getting driver's license, and it's a nationwide trend. Now, in some places, it's probably more relevant than others, but these younger generations, they don't want to drive. They want to use transit, they want to bike, and they want to walk. And so as you all think about Tucson's future and thinking about the jobs of the future, how do you begin to plan for that now and put the infrastructure in now to continue to be competitive economically as a society? I mean, I think that people look at DC and will say, oh, well, you guys have the federal government. And that's true, but the government's a little bit under a third of our economy. Part of the success of the district's economy is we're able to attract businesses. People are willing to spend a lot of money for office space because they know if they go there, the talent is going to be there. We're attracting those economies, and even with the FBI, they were supposed to leave downtown DC. Now they're staying because they realize, well, this is really a great place to be because our workforce can get in by public transportation. So who knows if they'll re-up that conversation again. But people are really choosing to live in these urban areas, so there's a major economic benefit. Even for local businesses, and I really want to hammer that home too, is that local businesses really benefit when people are able to walk and bike to their stores, to their places of business. And when it comes to car-centric, what we're seeing now, just a trend, is that the strip malls, they're dying. They're dying all over this country because it's an old model. People don't want to drive. People are using Amazon, but also people are shopping at local businesses, but they want to be able to walk and be a part of an experience. This is an interesting thing. So State of Place, it's an interesting website where they've done all of this index. They've been crunching all of this data. So this huge index takes into account walkability, density, population, and so they came up with this score. And they've scored all these different these areas. I believe in Arizona they did Phoenix, but they've scored different cities around the country. They came up with this index. And what they found is that's the economic benefits from just moving from one index to the next index. And so they do have data available that you all can look at and crunch to see what it means for Tucson. But it's showing that there is an economic benefit to walkable and bikeable communities. And then there's just mobility. It's really about giving people different options. As I said, in my advocacy world, I firmly believe that people should have transportation options. One of the great things about living in DC right now, I don't own a motor vehicle, so that is an expense that I don't have to worry about. But every time I step out of my building, I have 10 different transportation options. I can take Metro if it's not on fire. we have a fire issue. But I can take Metro, I could take the bus, I can use Capital Bike Share, I can use one of the 5 new dockless bike shares that just got released last week, I can use my own personal bike, I could use Car2Go, which are these little cars that move around, I could use Zipcar if I really need to use a car, I can use any of the shared mobility and taxi. So every time I step out of my house, I have options. And that's really, to me, what it's about, is that people have options. And even with transit service, it's that, connecting people to shops and to schools. One of the things that we are looking at in DC is we have congestion. And so the old model of congestion is level of service, volume and capacity of cars, right? But if we always look at level of service, we would never make any decisions because everything fails, right? Every intersection fails in DC during the rush hour. So we're looking at new metrics, and we're looking at the number of people we can get through the corridor. And what is that's doing? It's allowing us to make different decisions. I'm working on a project now on 16th Street where the 16th Street buses are 3% of the vehicles, but they're moving over half of the people through this one corridor. So over half of the people are moving on 3% of the vehicles. And one of the things we're trying to do now is implement bus-only lanes because we can't get the buses down 16th Street because they are caught in congestion. What that also means is that if we put in a bus-only lane and we take out capacity, that we are going to create congestion, or delay rather, for people and motor vehicles. And the city has made the decision that said, well, that's okay, because we've met our metric of moving people. The role of the District Department of Transportation is to move people, and we are moving people. And so we're using different metrics now. Another example is we have an intersection where we just put in a Barnes dance. And for those of you that may not know, a Barnes dance means that there's a signal just for pedestrians. So the pedestrians can move in either direction. They can walk diagonal, they can do either leg of the street. And part of how we got that in is under a traditional traffic engineering level of service, it would have never happened because the intersection fails. But by adding in the Barnes dance where the pedestrians have their own cycle, we can actually get buses through the intersection. We can actually get cars through the intersection. From in terms of the number of vehicles, we're increasing that number that are getting through this intersection, although through traditional methods, they are failing. And so some of the things to think about in terms of transit service, of thinking of different metrics of, are we really moving people through streets? And if that's the goal, we've met the goal. And it's not always about the vehicles themselves. And this is just an example of fixed route accessibility. Paratransit is expensive. There is not any transit agency in this country that will tell you that paratransit isn't expensive. It's a largely subsidized cost. In DC, I think it's like $32 a ride subsidized. It is very expensive. But if transit stops are accessible, that expense goes down. We've been investing millions in our city to make our bus stops more accessible. And it's not the bus stop itself, people have to get there. So it's making sure that the streets leading to the bus stop are accessible for people in a wheelchair. And guess what? If you do that, then when you're pushing, a stroller or you're pulling a piece of luggage, it makes it easier for you too. And so, just in summary, so with choice, there's transit, bikes, walking, wheelchairs, skateboards, cars, freight. Another interesting thing that we're dealing with is we have these little delivery robots now on the streets of DC. It's kind of trippy, but we have that now that's added to our roadways, so we'll see what that means moving forward. And so then the transition into Vision Zero. So all of this really is the sister to the Vision Zero. And Vision Zero is zero traffic-related deaths. That's saying that 35,000 people are dying on the roadways in the United States every year, and it's unacceptable because we can avoid it. We can design for it, we can fix the problem. And so we worked on the DC Vision Zero plan. It started off with data, right? Because without data, you just have an opinion. But it really is about backing up your decisions with data. Education and enforcement, those are linked. One of the things that we heard from the police force, and they were very involved in the Division Zero planning, they were at every meeting, is that enforcement is fine, but don't rely on us. We should not be your first method for enforcing traffic safety. Now, we should be thinking about dangerous driving if someone is driving really fast, really reckless, if there is under the influence issues, but we should not be your first line of defense against jaywalking. And we should not be your first line of defense against some of these other issues. Why don't you design properly? And so engineering was its own. And so in building the Vision Zero plan, we benchmarked off of other plans. At that time, New York had done theirs, San Francisco, LA, they'd all done their Vision Zero plans. We did interagency meetings. Our plan was built with over 35 agencies within the district, and that includes fire and EMS. One of the interesting things that we learned from the fire department was they said we can't see bicyclists at dusk. We can't see them. But for by God go I, we haven't hit any, but we can't see them, and there's something needs to be done about that. The other thing that the fire department brought up is they don't even have a mechanism to be able to track when they serve people who have been in a crash from a bike. And so it was little things like that we just didn't know, but just by getting people in the room and having conversations like you're having today, we were able to solve some of these very minor problems very easily. Another big agency that was involved was the Department of Motor Vehicles. They were very involved. They upgraded our driver's manuals to include the new bike infrastructure and the new bike laws. They also implemented PSAs in the different DMV stations so that as you're waiting forever, when you're getting your driver's license, that you're getting this education. We did public engagement, and this is where equity becomes so important, is that we involved the community. We involved citizens of the District of Columbia. And then we had stakeholder meetings with different advocacy groups, both from the environmental side and then from people walking and biking. And one of the things that we heard around the city was that the top 3 concerns were speeding drivers, distracted drivers, people on their phones while driving, and then people ignoring traffic signals, and that went across all modes. Whether people were biking, walking, or driving, a big issue was people not obeying the traffic signals. In terms of who we engaged, it almost perfectly matched the demographics of the district. In terms of race, income, educational attainment, we had an entire summit just for youth. We had 300 young people in a room where we got them involved in the conversation about safety. And we actually learned some very interesting things. One of the things that they said was, sometimes I jaywalk because I'm in a neighborhood that's not my neighborhood. I don't want to get jumped, right? And those are things that as an adult we don't think about, right? Like I don't remember being young. You guys might, but you forget about things that you dealt with at 16 that you're not dealing with at your age now. And they were very involved and very engaged. And where that led us to was we crowdsourced data from the public. Don't be afraid to use the public as a data source. Yes, we have crash data. That's great. But what the public told us was, here are where we're having safety issues. And these are all coded by mode. They're coded by issue. And what that allowed us to do was to really be proactive. So as an example, on the right is crashes. Those are crashes. These are for people walking. So that's where there are crashes. So where it's really, really, really yellow in the center, that's where there's a lot of crashes. On the left, that is the concern. So this is the data that we crowdsource from the public. And so you'll see that where there's areas that the public says there's a concern, yes, there are crashes. But then there are areas, like right over here, where it's really lighting up as a public concern, but there's like a crash maybe. So instead of waiting for crashes to happen, instead of waiting for people to die, the district now can go in and say there's something happening in this area. And as a matter of fact, they're moving forward with a project now to fix 17th Street, which is where a lot of that yellow is, and they're fixing that street. And part of it came from being able to be proactive. The public is saying that there's a concern, so let's go in and address the concern before people die, right? We shouldn't have to wait for people to die to fix it. And that's the whole thing with Vision Zero. We have a bunch of strategies within the plan. Some of them are, and each strategy has an agency tied to it as an owner. So some of the strategies like, and I know this is not readable at all, but the district public schools, all second graders got bike education last year. So every second grader got a bike education class as part of physical education. The other thing we started implementing are safe neighborhoods. So looking around areas where there are vulnerable users, like schools, parks, senior centers, lowering the speed limit to 15 miles per hour. And then making sure the infrastructure around it also matches that, because just because you change the numbers on the sign doesn't mean people are going to necessarily drive slower. So all that to say, to wrap up, so we can leave time for questions. So the old paradigm is, really wait till there's a problem. We're very forgiving of our infrastructure. We build wide roads, 12-lane road, 12-foot lanes. We design for high speeds, level of service, right? We need a level of service A, so that the cars can just fly up the street, because heavens forbid anyone be delayed for work. We encourage this high-risk behavior. People are driving too fast. People are crossing mid-block because we make half-a-mile blocks, right? I'm not walking a half a mile out of my way just to get, I can see it right there. One of the things, Emiko, our office is about 2 blocks away. And one time I was at her office and I'm like, I need to cross because I need to go right there, but I now have to walk around, but it's right there. So thinking about mid-block crossing so that people can go where they want to go, because people are going to do it anyway. And it limits land use. We've been a country of sprawl, and I think we're finally realizing that we can't keep going out. We have to think about our land uses and how do we use it a lot better. So the new paradigm is changing the behavior through design. One of the things that I have one of my traffic engineer gurus that I follow, he says either you have to allow the behavior or you have to prevent the behavior. Those are your only 2 options when it comes to design. And it's better to allow it. So figuring out how to design how people are going to move. And a lot of times people will tell you how they want to move. You'll see the patches of dirt where someone has created their own walking path. So we know where people want to move. So making sure to design that we're encouraging that we're getting users through physical and environmental cues. So again, if I just change the number of a street sign from 40 miles an hour to 20, people aren't going to go 20 if the lanes are 12 feet wide. So we have to think about, well, how do we redesign the street to also create a sense that, okay, I need to slow down on this road. We want slower vehicle speeds. I know that people will say, well, no, I got to get to work on time. But there's a lot of information, a lot of data out there that the slower people go, if there is a crash, there is a less likelihood of fatality. We want to encourage walking, biking, and transit use, and that's really the key to successful, complete streets. And with that, there's really no one-size-fits-all. Remembering that every street doesn't have to do everything for everybody. It really is thinking about how do you accommodate within a network. So for example, when we did the Move DC plan, we said, okay, if we're going to put a streetcar on this street, we'll make it so people can bike on the street, but let's move the bikes to the opposite streets. So therefore they can still move and they still have options. So it's thinking about complete networks that fits within the context of that community. There are some communities where we don't really need to add a bike lane when there's like 3 cars an hour. It's very low volume. We may not need to add a bike lane, but we may need to think about just other ways to have a complete street and apply to every street project. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. No questions. Yes.
I have 2 questions, but I think they're really related. And one is, what is the difference between complete streets as compared to context-sensitive design or the placemaking that, for instance, the project for public places does? Because there's similarities, but maybe differences. And then 2, how is land use incorporated into this as opposed to just something, I was reading the materials, it said we consider land use as a planner for 35 years, considers the word I hate, be considered objective. So those are the 2, and I think they're very much related.
So for the first question was about how is this related to the people for public spaces?
Well, are there differences between complete streets and context-sensitive design or the placemaking that, for instance, the project for public spaces does?
There are probably very nuanced differences, but they all share the same basic philosophy. in terms of thinking holistically. I mean, my personal view is you really have to think about a street building face to building face, and then that ties into your land use question. It really is about the building face to building face. Because if I have a street that I want people to do 25 miles an hour, well, if on either side of that street you have parking lots and then, you know, Walmart, people aren't going to go 25 miles an hour. I really don't care how you design that street because everything feels so far. But the more that you can close in that street, you see what I'm saying? Like, so if you have trees, if you have buildings that even are 2 stories high, it begins to frame the street in a way that makes you feel like I need to slow down. So land use is extremely important in terms of complete streets because, you know, for example, and I don't want to talk about it because you're going to do it later. One of the activities that you'll do later, it's an example where you have a very wide street, you have high speed, and you can lower the speed limit and you can narrow the lanes, but really until you address the land use on each side, you're not going to really get to the goal.
If I love that question, and I think the way that I think about it is, your first question was like, how does this relate to CSS or context-sensitive design or solutions? And the other is placemaking, and I think they're both, I would say, they are elements of complete streets. We'll get into this in the policy question. Actually, all your questions fit into really how we start to talk about it is the nuances of complete streets,
Right.
which is exactly what Veronica is saying. So what the question says is, if we are building, let's say, a complete street, a corridor, it needs to be really a complete street needs to be context sensitive, and what that means is what you're going to slap in front of my house in Washington D.C. might not even be appropriate for what you put in front of downtown Washington D.C. and what you're going to put around the university might be different than when you're going to put around your downtown or a residential neighborhood. They can look vastly different. Like a complete street doesn't have to be a road diet with bike lanes and sidewalks. In some communities, it's about that networktivity, and so it could be a bike boulevard. We saw some of your bike boulevard. We saw a bike boulevard yesterday, but it needs to fit the context of the surrounding area. I think placemaking is another really big part of it.
Because to me, I guess there's 2 ways of looking at designing transportation. What I liked about context-sensitive design, for instance, and I think also for the placemaking, is that they look at what are you trying to create, and then you design the road to fit what you're trying to create, as opposed to the other way that happens too much is we decide what kind of road we want to go through here, and then we'll try to figure out what kind of land uses we'll put afterwards. So
Right.
it's a very totally different, those are 2 opposite perspectives, and I think you end up with 2 completely different
Yeah, and I
cities.
think the problem, not the problem, but I think the issue, and we'll talk more about land use in the next section, but that, most of, and Tucson could be a little different, but most of what you're doing is actually, most complete streets projects end up being retrofits. And so you're dealing with current land use, and so you do have to lead in a way, like in a perfect world, you lead with land use, you lead with kind of how you're going to develop the space, and then you build the transportation to support that. The fact of the matter is, in the country, most of what we're doing is retrofitting a street, like the exercise, and so we have to deal with the land use, but that's going to probably come afterwards.
But sometimes leading with transportation can trickle out into your land use. A great example is we have 8th Street Northeast in DC, where after the 1968 riots, it was decimated. It had been vacant all the way up until the early 2000s, where there were like kind of businesses, they were struggling. Well, we put in, there was the whole streetscape project, which put in wider sidewalks, better looking sidewalks, added in green infrastructure, added in all these other different elements in addition to the streetcar. And even though it took 10 years for the streetcar to get running, which is a separate issue, however, just that has spurred development on 8th Street. So there was the first wave of restaurants and retail that have come in. Now there's a huge hole in the middle of 8th Street where they're putting in more mixed use. There's a Whole Foods now. There's like a grocery store every block. But this area in just 5 years has transformed tremendously, but for the fact that there was this infrastructure in transportation in a way that was, let's really make it a place, let's really make it a street that's complete, and that accommodates a future need.
I was interested in you were talking about, walking for health, which we've looked at that a lot in Tucson and talked a lot more about it in recent years. But there's something that I've heard from parents when I've worked with on some of these types of projects, which is they're tremendous, and I think part of this is our news media and everything, tremendous worry about children's security. And so they're not letting children walk, not because, but because they're worried. Now, I know we have the walk to school kinds of programs, but I think that's a real issue. And the more we have news that feeds into those kinds of fears, the more that happens.
Two things. One, so a situation happened in Maryland where a parent had decided that their kids were mature enough to walk to the park. So a nosy neighbor called and reported the parents, and so child services, protective services got involved, and the kids were like 10 and 11. So child protective services got involved, the parents were required to do classes. It was a whole big thing in the news media. And it's a challenge because that parent made a decision that, well, I think it's okay for my child to be able to make it a half a mile to the park. So that is a real issue to overcome. I think that, and it's very challenging too because of our culture of the nosy neighbor culture. I remember, growing up in the suburbs where I knew everyone on my block, and if I did anything wrong, my mom was gonna get a phone call before I made it back to the front door. And so that is a cultural issue. So thinking of, creative ways to,
Well, I think a really good, I don't mean to interrupt,
That's
but so we don't work in isolation, and I think that's why I show up with the steering committee, and one of the other groups that works with the Voices campaign, and I work really closely, is the Safe Routes to Schools National Partnership, because and they work kind of from the engineering perspective, so you actually have to create safe places to walk, and that's, in that sidewalks, it's also lighting, but it's also creating a culture. They run days where kids get more comfortable with it. There may be a chaperone who's bringing, let's say you live in a cul-de-sac and you're starting to build connections, you do have a parent that volunteers a day a week, because you do need to address those, and it is that culture. So I would, as part of that, looking at programs like Safe Routes to School is excellent.
Okay, I was just wondering about how you guys, and I know it's part of the policy, but how you in other communities have addressed this issue where we have this inverse relationship now where people are leaving the suburbs, coming to inner cities, and just the problems with, gentrification and culture clashes and just affordability and how it seems to me that the new slums will be the suburbs and how we basically again keep this issue of balance when it never seems like there's ever a mixture. It's always a displacement.
So I have to is the word, digress a little to a personal anecdote about how I got involved in this, is that one of the jobs I had after graduate school was working for an elected official who worked in a first-ranked suburb of the city of Seattle. So I grew up in Seattle. And where Seattle is known for its walkability and bikeability and progressiveness, one, I think that there's things, it's just like DC, there's things that you're still going to find within, but in the outer rings, the suburbs look like most suburbs in the United States, except south of the city around the airport and the area that she represented, it's where a lot of, it's majority, what we call the majority minority area. It has the highest concentration of low-income populations and the lowest car ownership. It also has the worst infrastructure, if you were to do an audit of sidewalks and bike lanes and access to transit. And it also has, I know we have health people in there, the worst health disparities in the county. When I started that job, I'd been at the university, and I lived next to the University of Washington, which is positioned next to the bridge, which will take you to Microsoft. And so we had health outcomes of countries in Scandinavia. I was going to live as long. I lived next to a beautiful park. It was an arboretum. I was half a block from a bus stop. I would now be a quarter of a mile away from the new light rail there. My convenience store was an organic food market, I kid you not. And I drove in 15 minutes to this area south of the airport where they had health outcomes of communities, developing countries in Africa. And it was a 15-minute drive, and it was largely linked, I think, to the infrastructure. I will not say that Complete Streets is going to solve that all. I think you have to, one of the reasons that we're positioned in Smart Growth America is that, I don't personally, because that's not my area of expertise, work in issues of affordability or workforce development or placemaking. I think creative placemaking has come into, but you have to look at this as one of the strategies. Affordability, I think housing affordability is one of the largest issues facing our country. With that said, when you are thinking about regionally building these networks, you have to think about, how do you build that into the inner ring suburbs as well? Because the people who are most likely to probably be using transit or other forms of transportation to access jobs are going to need that as well. I did a workshop similar to this in the city of San Jose, which is like the heart of Silicon Valley. And they've gotten beyond the point where service workers can't live there, where now city employees can no longer work in San Jose. And so they've had to address transit. For Veronica had the slide where I think for most of us, 18% of our take-home income goes to transportation, but a half for low-income families goes to transportation. That's largely because they can't take transit. You have to own a car.
Yeah, and that's where I think, housing policies come in, and Complete Streets can't isolate in a vacuum. DC is becoming an unaffordable city, and part of it is we didn't have things in place before it came, but that's where cities like Tucson, you all can learn from the things that we did well and the things that we didn't do well. One thing that is part of DC is that there is a housing trust fund. And so it does provide down payment assistance for lower and even middle income people. So the salaries up to a household income of like $130,000. So if you're at up to $130,000, the district will subsidize part of your down payment. So it's a pathway to ownership. And they have it for lower income, it's a little bit more. So there's a path to ownership. And part of our unaffordability is triggered by some other things in terms of we have a height limit in the city, so buildings can only be so high, and our land is expensive because we don't have a lot of it. So there's a lot of other things that are also driving housing prices. But as you all are thinking about Complete Streets, it is about that housing piece has to be there. And even one of the things that the mayor said is the investment in education. One of the things that the district has done well and been a leader on is investment in early childhood education. So we have universal pre-K. So starting at 3 years old, any child in the District of Columbia can go to public school for free. So what that does for parents as affordability is that's 2 less years of daycare, which is huge when daycare is as much as a mortgage sometimes. And what that is also done in lower income communities, when you actually look at the elementary schools, now that it's been like 5 years, 6 years now, but now that first group has trickled through and they're getting tested, their test scores are going up. So even in very low income areas with with people who are at and below poverty, we are seeing increases in test scores, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're in the pipeline earlier. And now the city's grappling with, well, do we lower the age? We don't have the capacity, but do we lower the age? And then what that's also doing is raising housing values as well. Yes.
Veronica, you talked about the change in metrics from level of service to number of people's move in DC. I'm guessing there was some pushback on that. And I wondered if you could talk about some of the challenges. Right, particularly.
It's been challenging. So one, I'd say the biggest change in terms of that is there was change in the traffic engineering department. And that's quite frankly what was the biggest reason for we're able to get past these older metrics. We had a retirement that happened within the traffic engineering department. So now most of the traffic engineers, they're in their mid-30s. So it's run by engineers who get it. Which is allowing us to make these decisions. The other thing that we've been doing a lot more is rather than running this to prove, delay, we just started taking out lanes. So as an example, one of the projects I worked on was a livability study, and we recommended reducing the capacity of a roundabout from 2 lanes to 1 lane. And the community, of course, was like, it's gonna be like gloom and doom. I'm gonna have people like on my daisies, I don't know. Like everything is like doom. So what we ended up doing was the traffic engineers allowed us to just take out a lane, just put some cones and take out a lane and then actually collect data to see what actually happens. Because I think part of the challenge is there's this over-reliance on traffic models where we know once you're at a street, they're just not as accurate. So sometimes it's, let's just take out the lane and test it for 2 weeks and see what happens. And what we found, there was no delay. There was no change in traffic. And so now it allows that project to move forward, to reduce that capacity, to make it safer. So that's been some of it, and a lot of it has just come from a leadership change, a philosophy change. And I think the biggest thing is passing the Vision Zero policy and having the plan and the strategy that the mayor has held up and said, this is our playbook for safety, and the fact that you have all the departments in, you have fire, you have EMS, you have the police that are saying, yes, this is important, has allowed a lot of this to move forward. It's still painful. I'm not gonna pretend like it's not, but we're at least we have the cover of a policy, and that's some of what we'll talk about today is once you have a policy, once we say that this is who we are, then that's what you have to do. I mean, and even if there's pushback from the public, we say, but we've said as a city, we don't want people to die. And so we need to make these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of two additional thoughts is one, it does become a policy decision, but I think it becomes an even higher level than just transportation, is you need to figure out, and your vice mayor said this, is what are the kind of beyond just transportation, what are your overall goals? If it's mobility, but it's also economics, it's public health, it might be access to jobs, and those should be driving from a higher level to kind of perform what you measure. I know because of MAP 21, which was 2 transportation bills ago, your MPOs, and your states will be having to do performance measures and setting benchmarks. And we've been working with MPOs at Smart Growth America to look at kind of beyond level of service. What does that look like? And we're using, I feel like I'm an advertisement from them, but a program called Sugar Access to look at their performance measures. The MPOs that we're working with have to do with access to jobs. And that's the big way. So we're kind of moving down because that's a bigger level policy issue that it's okay to tolerate an LOS F because you're achieving other things, but that has to come from, are your goals in the DOT relating to your overall kind of vision for your city?
Yeah, and then for the freight issue, I do want to touch on that. We had a pilot program. Okay.
I had a bug like flying in my nose. Okay. Sorry, did you see me swatting it and then just right in my nose?
As you talk about that access for jobs,
Yeah.
specifically, and you look at Tucson, generally, as where we are, there's going to be areas downtown, for instance, of these pockets that are going to fit what you're describing almost perfectly. There's other areas, of course, that are completely different. So as we construct this document, whatever that may be, whether it's portion of Vision Zero and, as we end this, I'm struggling with how we determine, overall broad policy, and then how do we dive down into that specific policy by general area, because they're going to be different depending on context of the community. So adopting a huge policy that we evenly follow, and how do we construct it in such a manner that we have several area policies all along within this broad spectrum, and I guess that's kind of where I'd like to go.
Yeah, can I push you off
Sure.
16 minutes?
Absolutely.
Because that's what we're going to be getting into
Okay, sure.
at 11. Because I know we have about 1 minute left.
Super.
No, but we're going to answer all your, and if we don't, you can find me afterwards. Accepting happy hour drinks.
So how many people had questions? Because we can do rapid fire. So if you had a question, raise your hand. So we have 3? Okay, back.
You mentioned involving students as part of this planning process as one of the community users. My question would be, how did you do that? How did you select the student groups to reach out to? And then from there, what was the follow-up in terms of the actual feedback and power that those students had advocating for a specific policy?
So this thing with students, I am all about a captive audience. So what we used were the summer youth employment students. It was their job, so they had no choice but to be there. And we had them all come in, but they were very engaged once we were involved. And a lot of their feedback was used to shape how we looked at policies. A specific example, one of the things that their concern is they wanted to make sure that there would be public transportation subsidies for them as they went into the school year. And so that was something that we made sure was captured. So in DC, our public buses are the public transportation system. So the kids take metro rail and buses to school, and so that was something that was included. So making sure to constantly take their feedback. Another specific example was they wanted to be included in future public transportation decisions. And so our regional transportation agency has created a youth advisory kind of council in order to continue to engage. How do we work with the youth? How do we, fix the behavior of the youth on public transportation? So those conversations are continuing to happen. Hand over here.
Oh,
It can wait, it'll wait till another time.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so, I'm an advocate, I'm not a professional. I'm very inspired by your presentation. And one of the things I want to come back to is the change of metrics. So in some of my advocacy work, I've come up against this idea that the appropriate speed limit is that which 85% of the drivers obey. Now, that's great if your lanes are like 2.5 feet wide, that'll get you good speed. Great. But there's stuff going on the sides.
yeah.
There are kids, there's bike lanes. So I'd like to know, from your point of view, in your traffic engineering work, what that as a metric, does that metric make sense, the 85%?
I just whispered, because the coalition actually just worked on this, but our position is, so it was no surprise, so the NTSB, which is the National Transportation Safety Board, they're like the people you see on the news when there's like an Amtrak crash or a plane crash. They actually just came out with a study about 6 weeks ago that essentially says speed kills, which we know. But one of the things we did, and we talked with the vice chair, this woman named Bella Denzar, about really, yes, you can talk about the 85th percentile setting speed limits, but our official position is that you've got to change them. You've got to design for lower speeds. Like you can put up a speed limit, but what you're going to do with changing the speed limit versus what you can do with design, and that means narrowing roads, narrowing lanes, doing traffic calming, trees, activating the space, actually adding on-street parking has a much greater effect on lowering speed, which results, I mean, we have this chart I could bring up that the faster cars going, the more likely someone is to be killed, but you have to do it through engineering.
Not by just setting the speed limit aside.
Right.
People are gonna go wherever they feel comfortable going to
Right.
the airport.
Right, and when you do a fast and flat, straight road, you're gonna drive that fast.
No matter what that sign says.
And just to piggyback on, the conversation here has been around, well, just make the speed limit lower, stick it on the signpost. And that's where the 85th percentile conversation comes, because realistically, no matter what you put up there, that number of people are still going to go that fast.
Yeah, I mean, and just to emphasize, you have to change the 85th percentile. So it's, what is the desired behavior?
Exactly.
So if the desired behavior, I need the 85th percentile to be 30 miles an hour, then I need to design such that people will go 30 miles an hour.
Right, and it's not a question of just changing the sign.
No, you can change the sign, nothing will be fixed. And we have, and I will say this too, I'm cutting in the break, I'm sorry. But I do want to say this too, is that sometimes you can test. I think the thing about the engineering profession is we are scared to test anything. But paint and pylons are a great way to test out something before going into construction. So one of the things that we've been doing on a couple of my projects where we're recommending like closing a slip lane, instead of just closing it, of literally going out and sending a crew with, for $5,000, $10,000, some paint, adding in the plastic pylons, and then just see what happens. Is that changing the speed, or even narrowing it with paint and see how that's changing speeds? So sometimes it doesn't always have to be this big process. There's a lot that can be done and be tested before going into full design and implementation. Yes.
I'm a traffic engineer. I'm over 55 years old, and I get it. So I just want to make clear that you don't have to be in your 30s to be enlightened.
It's very true. My best engineer.
Well, first of all, on speed limit, I think we, as traffic engineering or recovering traffic engineer, 85th percentile is flawed. If you go on the crash modification factor, it's all about mean speed. In other words, what your mean speed, what your speed differential is. There actually is a CMF that shows that you can decrease the severity of crashes based on that mean speed. So that the thing I think, the biggest challenge we have, and I've worked for the county, is how do we get people thinking that the definition of a quality of a road goes beyond the pavement? And I think that's very expensive, and there's lots of things we'd like to do, and roundabouts, narrower streets, sidewalks, whether those things people walk on the side of the road. But our latent defect in terms of all these roads that we have out there, we have so much latent that's not that type of street. And the resources, and if you look at that, I think the American Society of Civil Engineers says that U.S. is only spending 3.5% of our gross national product on infrastructure. We need to be spending like 6.5%,
Right.
or 5.5%.
We get an F.
Yeah. So so don't think that the engineers don't want to do that, but we don't have the resources.
Yeah, I think that gets into, you have to show case studies of other places, and we have a lot of that information is that, it's part of, doing your public engagement and education, that there are benefits other than, it's work investment. Veronica had a slide that showed our report, Safer Streets, Stronger Economies, where we looked at 37 complete streets projects and the return on investment, and redefined the return on investment. So it was mobility, but it was also property taxes, it was net new jobs, it was mode shift, it was safety as well, and it was averted collision cost. And the way that we are able to use that report, part of the problem though is we only had 37 projects to look at because people aren't collecting enough data. So it's also making the case about why you need to collect data beyond LOS.
Yeah, and I think that's also too where the land use conversation has to come in. So I'm also on the ASCE's policy committee, and we just passed a Vision Zero policy. So the civil engineers are getting it. It took 2 years, but we got there. But that's where the land use comes in, because sometimes that increased value from whatever economic driver that you have for land use can pay for infrastructure. And that's some of the things that we're seeing in the district is as you're adding value, where a strip mall that has died becomes a town center. And we know who's really doing it well as a case study is LA. LA is a very car-centric city, but they are really densifying a lot of their dead strip malls, and they're reaping an economic benefit from that they're able to invest back into what they're doing. And also to a model that I've seen in Alexandria, Virginia, is having the developers do some of the infrastructure. It doesn't always have to come from the city. Is if you have a development project, we'll have them do more and beyond their project, because it's, from an affordability standpoint, it's cheaper for them. And that those are ways to help projects move forward, but it has to be a part of the negotiation. On the land use side, you have to know what you want when you're at the table with the developers.